G'day, how you going? What are you doing today? I hope you're having a fantastic day today wherever you are in the world. It's been a beautiful day. We've had light rain. It's not as hot as yesterday. It's Australia Day, sorry day. And I always keep it thinking about the original settlers, people that lived here for 70,000 years on this day. It was their culture. It's totally been wiped. Okay, I'm going to read a book now. I remember a while back about talking about cameras and all kinds of stuff. And in the Vietnam War, when they first started using night vision goggles, they used a type of night vision device that used a green, red, and blue frequency. And the spectrum that they were using was actually picking up ghost-like creatures. There were soldiers looking out the back of helicopters and seeing flying creatures following them. Very interesting. So hang with me and let's have a look at it. It's a really interesting story. So, The Secret of Seeing Charlie in the Dark, the Starlight Scope, Techno-Anxiety, and the Spectral Mediation of Enemy in the Vietnam War. Richard A. Ruth, Department of History, United States Naval Academy. Okay. Abstract. The introduction of night vision technology during the Vietnam War transformed how US military men and their communist enemies fought at night. The Starlight Scope, seemingly a miraculous light amplifying powers, made heroes seeing unseen targets easier to see, and the sole possessor of this new technology, American soldiers, had a profound tactical advantage of operating at night. But they also paid a price for this new edge. Burdened by the scope's weight, untested technology, and extreme secrecy, the servicemen suffered. They endured physical, psychological, and emotional stress unforeseen by the military leaders who pushed for the scope's development during the Cold War. The new rifle-mounted scope figuratively transformed night into day and paradoxically made it harder for many American soldiers to pull the trigger. Keywords: Starlight Scope, night vision technology, Vietnam, sniper, psychological effects. Right. 1965, United States military committed its first combat troops to South Vietnam. It sent along with the first wave of American soldiers and Marines a new technological marvel that allowed its troops to see the guerrilla enemy in the dark. The Starlight Scope, as it was soon christened, amplified ambient light, mostly from starlight, moonlight, and the sky glow. Along with this heavy piece of machinery, one of the first models weighed more than 40 pounds. The US soldiers bore the anxiety of protecting a technology that American enemies had not yet acquired. Each soldier responsible for his squad's scope and expected to destroy it before allowing it to fall in the enemy's possession. And in the anxious bond that developed between the bearer and the top-secret technology, the Americans developed a view of the enemy mediated by the ghostly images that appeared to them through the scope's viewfinder. Their descriptions of the Viet Cong, in appearance and in essence, were a manifestation of the highly pixelated forms of greens, greys, blacks that the scope conjured in the jungle darkness. The scope played a significant role in furthering the popular characterization of the guerrillas as spectral beings who occupied an otherworldly realm, and it was also responsible for generating positive feelings and even affection for the enemy in some American soldiers. When Soviet tanks smashed their way into Budapest to put down Hungarian uprising of 1956, the profiles of the armoured vehicles occupying the city presented a mystery to military analysts in the United States. Examining the photographs and the footage of the Soviet invasion, the Americans were disconcerted to see the empty sockets that were the tanks which had been carrying high-powered turret-mounted searchlights. The analysts could not understand how Soviet tank crews were able to find their way through the dark without artificial illumination. Their worry was that the Red Army might be in possession of a hitherto unknown night vision technology that allowed their crews to see in the dark from within their tanks. Schultz, 1969. Such a breakthrough seemed possible in the light of the Soviet capture of many Nazi Germans' best scientists at the end of World War II. The Germans had been working on an improved nighttime cyberscope throughout the war, and by 1944 they had produced their own infrared scope, the Zielgrat 1229, Bergstorm 2014. Small quantities of the ZG 1229, known by its creepy code name, Vampire, Vampire was distributed to German snipers in the final months of the war. Walter, 2005, 239. In the anxious climates of the Cold War that followed, the Americans were apparently less willing to consider that the Red Army's tanks were merely poorly constructed, equipped and maintained. Alarmed by the possibility that their communist bloc rivals had made significant technological breakthroughs, the Americans poured millions of dollars into various research projects in the night vision laboratory at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The 30 scientists then worked at the lab, saw human resources arrive with the money. By the mid-1960s, a team of 300 were working to create a portable device that would help soldiers turn night into day. The money and the expertise swiftly advanced the technologies being tested in the lab. Ultimately, the US military spent $20 million on the project, Schultz, 1969. The results of the push was a family of night vision devices of varying sizes and powers. Their introduction into US military units coincided most precisely with the first dispatch of combat troops into South Vietnam in March 1965. While the earliest and most portable of the devices carried the equipment designations AN/PVS-2 for Army-Navy personnel vision scope, the American combat troops applied the term Starlight Scope for it, and all the night vision devices that use the same ambient light amplification technology. Training manuals, published soon thereafter, bore the term Starlight Scope in the title, thus giving official endorsement to the casual term. In the Southeast Asian theatre of war in the late 1960s, there were essentially 3 distinct Starlight Scopes. The most common weighed about 6 pounds and was designed to be mounted on atop several personal weapons, including the M14, the M16 rifles, see Figure 1, the M60 machine gun, and the M79 grenade launcher, Department of Army, 1966. On nights with significant moonlight, the AN/PVS-2, which provided a 4:1 magnification, allowed the bearer to see a range of 300 metres. The miniscope, AN/PVS-3, a far smaller device introduced later in the war, was a handheld viewer that weighed only 3 pounds. 3 ounces, was it? Only 3 lbs, 4 ounces. I'm not sure what that is, sorry, because I do kilograms. But had roughly the same power of magnification of the heavier rifle-mounted scope. The largest Starlight Scope, with the AN/TVS-4, it was the 38-pound crew-operated scope that rested on a pole or a tripod. With a diameter of 8 inches and a 44mm imaging tube inside, this scope resembled a squat wastebasket. It was usually used to guide artillery. Before the Starlight Scope, American soldiers were greatly limited in their ability to fight at night. Although the human eye will accommodate itself nighttime viewing in about 30 minutes, its ability to perceive shapes and movement in the distance is quite limited. A soldier trained in nighttime reconnaissance and identification can only see about 50 metres away without the help of artificial illumination. Berry, 1988. The physical limitation has curtailed nighttime operations through history. Military men have long dreamed of the device that would allow them to see the enemy in the dark, preferably without being seen by the enemy. What can be characterized as the American search for modern night vision technology dates to World War I. In 1917, the United States Army Corps of Engineers sought to improve upon illumination flares by pointing a giant searchlight at its enemy positions, or by bouncing them off clouds or natural features of the landscapes. Private manufacturers created various high-intensity searchlights that were tested out in the trenches in the final months of the war. The lights had the advantages over the illuminated flares used by both sides in their power and duration, but they also had severe limitations and vulnerabilities. Their considerable weight rendered them difficult to move into offensive positions, their size made them easy targets for front lines, and the harsh environment and remoteness of the water trenches easily damaged delicate components. And worst of all, the indiscriminate blast of the white illuminated enemy and their friendly forces equally, those vulnerabilities regulated the early searchlights to largely defensive operations, to be turned on when attacked at night. Starlight Scope, 1984. The US military retrieved its interest in the night vision on the eve of the Second World War. In the late 1930s, Army engineers drew up the byproducts of research into an early television transmitter pioneered by the Radio Corporation of America, RCA. Developed a night scope known popularly as a snipescope. The infrared snipescope, the M1, and later model bore the designation M2, was a 2-part system. The top was an infrared flood lamp that could cast a beam onto the target. The lower part was an image-enhancing optic tube capable of seeing the infrared spectrum and magnifying the available light. The sniper scope was mounted upon modified M1T 3.30 caliber bearing on top of front group counterweight that also housed the power switch. The total weight was more than 30 pounds. On top of that, a 6-bolt battery pack and a transformer unit capable of generating 20,000 volts to power the device was carried separately in a shoulder bag. All of the parts and extra weight had to be carried into the battlefield by snipers accustomed to travelling light and moving quietly. It also had considerably limited range, reported to be 300 yards, but which was realistically effective for only about 75 yards, and only about 300 were distributed. Despite its promise, it enjoyed only a limited success in the night combat. In addition to its modest range, the infrared beam it emitted was easily detected by enemy units with similar infrared optical devices or even goggles with red-tinted lenses. The snipers who engaged with the electronics of the active system made themselves vulnerable to opposing snipers. Its flaws notwithstanding, it was an improvement on searchlights, but just barely. A Marine who used the sniper scope in the final year of World War II called it greatly overrated, preferring the steady stream of flares for illumination. Its shortcomings aside, the US Marine units were said to have used it in a great effect, demanding themselves from nighttime raids on Storfield battles such as the Tsushima and others. Meanwhile, the US military continued work throughout war on a passive night vision system that used ambient light. Its researchers had some successes, but by the end products were ultimately unsatisfying in both performance and size. The most promising of these inventions combined binoculars with other devices such as any oscillating mounts to stifle vibrations, and arrangement of mirrors to boost light. These devices, which look like greatly oversized binoculars, help pilots and sailors gain a clearer view of the enemy vessels in the dark. But their size and their fragility made them impractical to use by infantry units operating on the rough terrain. After the war, further research in passive night vision technology greatly abated. American ground forces continued to rely on modified version of the sniper scope in the Korean War and other conflicts in the early 1960s. The Vietnam War has been called the television war because of the vivid and timely news reports viewed by the American public through the medium of television. It is appropriate then to acknowledge the role of television played in the creation of this technology as well. In addition to RCA's infrared breakthroughs that made World War II era sniper possible, its research into television technology during the early 1950s led to the creation of the passive light intensification system necessary for modern light vision devices. In fact, it was a television tube of sorts that became what one technology writer called the heart of the Starlight Scope. In the early 1950s, television engineers developed a system by which one screen could capture low-light images and then transmit them to another screen where they would be analysed, amplified, arranged for viewing. The night vision technology in the late 1950s concentrated on using that method to transmit image from the field of vision into a screen at the eyepiece of the viewer via the orthicon tube. Developed by RCA in the late 1930s, which was supplanted a previous generation of television tubes in 1946. The first scopes created by Night Vision Laboratory had profound flaws. They were heavy and fragile, required a lot of electricity. Aiming for efficiency, its creators had constructed a single optical tube that could perform a varied functions necessary for night vision, capturing light, amplifying it, and transmitting the image it created. Over time, researchers found that breaking down the process into separate stages that could be performed by multiple components within a cascade tube, they could more efficiently transmit the images using less electricity. The resulting design was complex. Each model had 3 principal components: a multi-chambered intensifying tube, an optic system, and an electrical supply. A light struck an outer fiber optic lens coated with a photoemissive substance. An image entered into the first chamber, releasing electrons. The scope used a 15,000 volt potential to force these released electrons through an anode cone. The cone and the adjacent configuration were made specifically machined aluminium that shaped images as electrons sped through the cone's aperture. The electrons struck an inner fiber optic lens coated in phosphor that arranged the electrons into shapes for the viewer. This mediated image was now 40,000 times brighter than the actual image that had entered the device. The night vision unit of Electro-Optical Systems Laboratory in Pomar, California, produced the first scopes under tight security conditions. The lab belonged to Xerox, whose laboratory in nearby Pasadena had been developing laser-based technologies for the military throughout the early 1960s. Introduction to the battlefield. This is where it gets interesting. The Starlight Scope turned the tables on the enemies. The People's Liberation Army Force, PLFA, AF, the Southern Communist-dominated insurgents known popularly through the war as the Viet Cong, had previously enjoyed great mobility and freedom to operate at night. The GIS nickname their largely unseen guerrilla enemy Charlie as a shorthand derived from the NATO phonic Victor, Charlie, or for Vic, VC. The lack of progress against the guerrillas throughout the American advisory phase of the war from 1962 to 65 had frustrated the US Army advisors working to train the Army of Republic of Vietnam. The armed forces and their ally of South Vietnam, the US military planners, had hoped Starlight Scope and other recently developed technologies would mitigate the nighttime advantage held by the local guerrillas. The US Army PFC Timothy Vale explained, "I think strategically, emotionally, and every way possible, we knew that we owned the daytime, and the Viet Cong and the NBA, North Vietnamese Army, soldiers had more of an edge on the night, that they were more likely to be successfully maneuvering at night, and that was because of our overwhelming advantage during the day that they would try to do things at night. They would try to move, to infiltrate, to attack. So nighttime was our time of necessary vigilance. It was certainly no time for us to ever let your guard down. It went from day to day convincing myself or reminding myself to remain vigilant at night." Although Vale had a vague recollection of seeing Starlight Scope carried by other units in South Vietnam, his fire base never had one of their own. The scope did not fully neutralize the indigenous soldiers' advantage of operating on a familiar terrain and among largely sympathetic civilian population, but it did give the Americans a new and unfamiliar edge when it came to operating in the darkness. As more Starlight Scopes were produced and distributed in the early years of the war, the American military found ever more motives for using them. They put them into helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft. They distributed them to Firebase and Guide Artillery US. Navy soldiers carried them aboard their riverine patrol boats. They became an integral equipment for nighttime ambushes, and they were a great boon to snipers. So revolutionary was the technology that the US Marine sniper, who experienced its introduction, called it the holy grail of sniper technology. The surprising and deadly power that the Starlight Scope brought to night operations made lasting impressions on the US Army Lieutenant Bill Parris. On the first night that his squad used the new device, he reported that their sniper spent the whole night knocking drinks off at about 300 yards because they were walking around. So all night long, this guy is up popping NVA because they're up walking around. Once it's dark, hell, they figure we can't see them, and he must have killed 12 guys that night. Official reports from the 3 years of the Starlight Scope's use confirm Paris's anecdotal reconciliation. After-action reports from the US Army, Navy, Air Force units who used the scopes detailed their effectiveness in its variety of innovative circumstances. Many analytical reports called for the increasing in their distribution and broadening their applications. For example, the US Air Force crews using Starlight Scopes in the cockpit of their aircraft during nighttime bombing raids along the Ho Chi Minh Ho Trail in southern Laos had far greater success locating and striking the enemy convoys. One survey compared to 3-day periods from 1966 to 1967 showed that the Starlight Scope contributed to a 10-fold increase in the number of trucks destroyed. Viet Cong and the NVA soldiers did what they could to foil the Starlight Scope. No longer able to rely on darkness to give them the edge over the Americans, and not possessing a night vision of their own, they tried simply adapting in the tactics to counter the scope's power. Some guerrilla units used natural objects to camouflage themselves, along with the sparkling white and green flashes visible on the Starlight Scope. In November 1970, a Marine corporal told a visiting reporter from Leatherneck magazine about one such defensive tactic encountered along the Highway 1 southeast of Da Nang. There was no moon out, dark as a coal bin at midnight. Well, we got a lot of fireflies over here. You know, there's millions of them flying around. Anyway, we're looking through our green light, the Starlight Scope, and we spot this VC almost up to our bunker. He's got a firefly pinched between the thumb and the forefinger of each hand, waving them around like they're flying while he's ducking up into our position. It would have worked too if we didn't have the green light. After several years of monitoring its use in Southeast Asia, the Pentagon officially revealed the Starlight Scope to the American public, and in the world of spring of 1968. The publicly blitz that accompanied the new openness about the device appears to have been engineered to generate optimism in the wake of the surprise and concern that generated by the siege at Kaishan, which began on the 21st of January 1968 at the Tet Offensive that followed 10 days later. The Starlight Scope itself was not strictly a secret prior to its unveiling, as foreign correspondents covering the war in Southeast Asia had been alluding to a classified night scope in their stories and reports for years. But the technology inside it and the specifications of its capabilities were presented to the press with a kind of fanfare more closely associated with the launch of a new car model, or even a new NASA rocket, and the press ate it up. Many military and technology reporters wrote about the scope's potential to hasten American victory in Vietnam. The invention and deployment of this miraculous device was rare good news story coming out of the war that had fewer and fewer of them with each passing month. The Los Angeles Times, for example, carried the story under the Pentagon quotation that called the scope the greatest untold story of the war. Headlines of Star News of Pasadena cited the scope's manufacturer announced Pasadena site saves GI lives, 1968. The Dominion News, Morgantown, New Jersey, declared this new Starlight Scope enables the Army to see Viet Cong in the dark, 1968. And the Army's own Stars and Stripes carried stories on the scope's efficiency under headlines such as Soldiers Use Scope to Clobber Reds, 1967. First-hand reports asserted that the Starlight Scope not only guided American sniper bullets, but it also prevented the guerrillas from eating rice because they could no longer build fires at night for fear of detection. And on 1966, another story pointed out that the American soldiers could now carry less ammunition with them because the scope had helped shorten the time it took for them to find the enemy. These stories suggest that the new technology was a literal manifestation of the figurative, the light and the end of the tunnel, that General S. William Westmoreland, commander of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, had proclaimed in Washington in November 1967. The Starlight Scope seemed to offer the edge of the United States military needed to finally achieve the victory over its night-shrouded and elusive enemy, the anxiety of the user. William McBride, a military historian specializing in technological innovation, has observed that the military options of technological have relied more on prejudice than utility. McBride has catalogued examples of resistance to the innovation based on bias generated by the warrior ethos that romanticizes the past while mistrusting new technology that therein rendered formula popular weapons or standard methods obsolete. Often, these resistance comes from war planners whose youthful exploits with a weapon, platform, technology, or tactic make them reluctant to adopt improved forms after they had risen to command ranks or civilian leadership positions. In this case, of the American military in Vietnam War, however, the resistance comes from troops themselves. Despite praise being heaped upon the Starlight Scope in the United States, back in the South Vietnam, there was considerable ambivalence about the new device from the men who actually used it. At the same time, there appears to be no evidence that U.S. commanders were aware of this evidence. While the American military leaders remained greatly enthusiastic about the scope's ability to further progress of the war, they failed to consider how this new and classified technology was affecting the psychological emotions and perceptions of the men using it. The detailed operation manuals that eventually appeared with the scopes addressed all the technological specifications and methods of operation, but nowhere in these volumes are there even a few words about what the scope might do physically or psychologically to the operator. As effective as this revolutionary night scope was, there were plenty of GIs who refused to use it. Some preferred their own night vision and methods of spotting the enemy that they had learned in advanced training programs such as Ranger School, and they feared that the illuminated viewfinder would diminish their nighttime senses. Some soldiers who used the earliest models believed that it made them vulnerable because the viewfinder cast a green light on the face of the user that could be seen by the enemy at close range. Others avoided it because they'd heard that the devices were prone to failure, which appears to be especially true for the first-generation Starlight Scopes. The weight of the scope was a problem for some. Novelist Tim O'Brien listed it as 6.3 pounds with aluminium carrying case in the operating tally of men and gear. That brings his celebrated novel, The Things They Carried, O'Brien, 1998. But some things tasked with carrying the scope on its inaugural operations, the added weight was unforgivable. They refused to carry a 6-pound piece of equipment that they did not know how to operate. Some early users felt uneasy about using one because they had not been trained on it, and in some cases had never realized that such a device existed until it was presented to them. One Marine Sniper first learned of its existence of Starlight Scope on the same night he was ordered to use it. But the principal reason that some of the soldiers avoided using the Starlight Scope was anxiety. The source of this anxiety was the secrecy surrounding the scope, which hindered its development and testing. Because the Starlight Scope was designed as classified material, it carried soldiers' consequences, and thus commanding officers were initially reluctant to employ the device. The soldiers who were entrusted with the first Starlight Scopes bore weighty and potential ruinous responsibility for them. Many feared the punishment promised to those who lost the Starlight Scope in the field. One Navy officer recalled quite scantly, "If you lose one of those things, it was your arse." Loss of a scope was a court-martial offence, but there were even worse punishment, as one veteran explained. Taking the Starlight Scope out of the field was a major responsibility. It came with solemn understanding that if there was an imminent threat of being captured or killed, the sniper team was to destroy the scope first with the grenade. It was also understood that there was no need to come back to Camp Carroll if for some reason you didn't have the Starlight Scope in your possession. Nearly all soldiers who had received the first-generation scopes carried a white phosphorus grenade with it. If they were in danger of being captured or required to leave their equipment behind, they were expected to use the incendiary grenade to burn up the scope. Often they would tape the grenade to the scope before going out on a mission to save time in the event of emergency. Other soldiers recall being told to fire tracer rounds down the tube to burn up its internal workings. Accounts of CGIs dying while protecting the still secret device on their rifle appeared in newspapers across the United States and beyond, and the recapture of the stolen top-secret US weapon retrieved special attention in American press stories from the period of Marines captured Viet Red Base 1967. One front-page banner headline obituary for American Army casualties stressed that the dying soldier managed to destroy the Starlight Scope so it wouldn't fall into the hands of the enemy. Anonymous, 1966. In addition to the disciplinary punishments meted out according to the guidelines of military justice, the American soldiers feared losing the device for other practical reasons. That thing cost $1,800. The soldier recalled, which was a lot of money in 1968 for a guy making $303 a month. There's that number. Oswald, 2004, other military personnel heard that the scope cost $3,000. One soldier remembers a larger model costing in the neighborhood of $30,000. Given the anxiety over money and court material, it's not surprising that the loss of the scope in the field set off a series of deceptions and crimes. In John Parker's memoir, his 2 tours of South Vietnam, the former U.S. Army lieutenant describes how the theft of the Starlight Scope by a group of Arvn soldiers embroiled 2 companies. When you lose a Starlight Scope, you have 2 options. The first one was to have your executive officer send you the beat-up non-operating Starlight Scope hidden back at the base. The second one was then taken into the field as often as possible. That scope was taken into the field as often as possible. The first time contact was made with the enemy, the shooter would shoot a hole in it and declare it a combat loss. The second option was to stand up like a man and report the loss to the battalion commander. When a lieutenant was responsible for the scope, exercising the second opinion, his battalion colonel told him he would not be allowed to leave South Vietnam until he had found it. When he had relayed a similar threat to a driver who had actually lost the scope, that a man exercised the third and less honourable option by stealing a scope from another company. That company, in turn, replaced their lost scope by pursuing the first option of deceptive substitution. The Army soldiers had more immediate fear relating to losing the Starlight Scope. They dreaded the tactical advantage transferred to their enemy if the Viet Cong was to acquire one. Stephen E. Atkins, a U.S. Army sniper in the Viet Cong province in 1968, wrote, "A Starlight Scope in the hands of an enemy sniper was a terrifying thought." In Moving Trees, the diary of Khan Sang Marine, James C. Oyster's entry for 26th of March 1968 captures this pressing fear. 26th of the 3rd. Lost the Starlight Scope. The word is it was captured, but I bet they just lost it. I bet they were out on patrol somewhere, and whoever was in charge of it laid it down, and when they moved out, they left it there. I guess the battalion commander was really pissed about it. One of the advantages we had was being able to see the gooks at night when we couldn't see us. Now, if they have the Starlight Scope, they're going to be able to see us at night too. And it kind of pissed me off too. They could have used that thing, look like grey alpha lines, and shoot me right in the head. Then there were what might be considered as more personal reasons for not liking the Starlight Scope. The untested technology itself posed severe physical threats to its user. Prolonged use may cause varying degrees of blindness. This was a consequence of the magnification properties of the scope. The earliest devices lacked light governance to protect the user from exposing their eyes to the burst of amplified light. An unintentional blast of light from a powerful source such as a spotlight or a flare was magnified into harmful levels when amplified directly into the eye of the user. This consequence was exploited by nighttime smugglers, some who worked for the Viet Cong, who put bright lanterns on their sampans to obscure the view of the American military personnel watching them. The blindness and the uncertainty that resulted generated a moral dilemma for the American troops observing them. Were the boatmen Viet Cong who were trying to avoid detection or scrutiny by blinding their enemy observers, or were they anxious civilians seeking an ally to ally the anxious Americans by illuminating their craft as a way of demonstrating their innocence through expression of openness? For the watcher on the side of the scope, the lantern-bedecked boats sparked a torturous internal debate. "We couldn't see what was on those boats," explained Edward Larry Oswell. "We had to make a shot, no-shoot decision based on whether we thought this is a nice guy bringing his rice to market or someone who got recoil rifles and is planning to shoot us." The scope could also cause long-term vision damage. Long periods of staring into the scope would take away the night vision of the user. Those who stared into the Starlight Scope for a week or more of nights found that they had lost their eye's natural night vision when they stopped using it. Right-eye dominant users pressed their left eye to the scope to preserve night vision in their right eye. Emil Hilgerder, the U.S. Army sniper who fought the South Vietnam in 1969, recalls, "If you look through the Starlight Scope for a while, you get a terrible headache. If you looked a long time, it really feels like it pulls your eye out of your socket. It was very eye-fatiguing to look through those things very long." The murky composition of the images posed a problem. In the midst of firefight, the black-green shadows that appeared in the viewfinder could not be positively identified as the enemy. Misidentifications were even more likely when Americans were fighting alongside Allied AVRN troops. One American veteran remained haunted by the possibility that he might have shot an ARVN ranger in the aftermath of an ambush. "I was looking through my starlight and I saw a figure approaching in our direction, so I put in my M16 head high in that direction and fired," recalled Dave Schreiser of that incident. Later that evening, several of the remaining ARVN soldiers who were attached to our squad were suggesting that someone in our squad shot him, and they believed that it was me, although his squad mates maintained strong doubts about his capability in the alleged friendly fire incident. The uncertainty generated by the unclear images has remained on his conscience for more than 4 decades after the event. Accounts on the 10th of July 1967 ambush, 1967. The scope's battery posed another technical problem. It was specially constructed battery created exclusively for the equipment. When the battery died, soldiers were obliged to acquire a new one from the military supply system. They could not simply hook up a common battery as a power source. The batteries themselves, therefore, become such a source of anxiety for the scope. American military personnel went on to great lengths to preserve these precious power sources. Units often put the batteries in refrigerators when possible to prolong their lives, and while such care had its benefits, it also had consequences. Bringing a battery from a near-freezing environment out into a hot, humid air of South Vietnam generated condensation on a thick cardboard coating that encased it. Over time, the water-soaked cases fell apart, and the surface water caused the device to short-circuit. And some soldiers just did not like what they saw through the scope. Others struggled to make sense of the stimulation presented to their eyes and brain. For the viewer familiar with visual renderings in only colour and black and white, images rendered through the Starlight Scope posed a challenge. They required a mental adjustment to translate the odd shapes, palettes and textures it produced in a recognisable and readable tellable. The tube generated a pale green aura, bathing all the viewer saw in a ghostly hue. While the principal shapes appeared as grey-black forms, human beings viewed through the scope had glowing eyes. Perhaps tellingly, one Marine sniper took the Starlight Scope to a cemetery on the first night that he used it because it seemed like a place to surprise a VC. This Marine believed he struck a Viet Cong soldier with a 3-round blast to the chest, only to watch as the guerrilla rose from the field of tombstones and ran away. After one of his squad shot a parachute flare into the night sky, the bewildered Marine watched through the Starlight Scope as the ghostly shadows swept across the cemetery under the miniature sun. The Marine's evocation of ghostly landscape was a common metaphor used by those who struggled to make sense of the world as seen by the Starlight Scope. Around them was otherworldly storm of glittering electronic phantoms and fireflies. The green-grey sparkles of fluorescent generated by rotten vegetation and dewdrops refracting faint bits of light. The soldiers who spent long nights peering into this strange electronic topographical arrangement began to see it not so much as an altered vision of the landscape before them, but as another world, a strange realm, that it can only be accessed through the scope. Vietnam War literature offers some of the best insights into what made soldiers uneasy about the Starlight Scope. More so than history, literature attempts to explain the emotional turmoil, to make sense of wartime confusion. It seeks to impose understandings on the bewildering experience and the moral dilemma. Novelists and poets explain this internal turmoil to evoke memorable language. In this literary memoir, If I Die in a Combat Zone, Box Me Up and Ship Me Home, novelist Tim O'Brien recalled the Starlight Scope as a kind of reverse telescope that seemed to reveal more than the unseen picadillos that lie buried in the psyches of the soldiers who gaze into them than it did about the enemy. And counting it for the first time, a squad of soldiers in O'Brien's memoir initially treat the Starlight Scope with dread. The GI tasked with carrying the device, Barney, complains that it weighs a ton. Irritated, he confesses that a week of lugging the device on patrol, he still does not know how it works or what it does. The best description he can offer is that the unfamiliar tool is a fucking kaleidoscope or something. Barney passes the scope to another GI, who grows curious about its purpose as the night deepens around the squad. This soldier, Chip, asserts that he sees fine without the science fiction tool, but continues to assemble it as the night wears on. His first view went into the eyepiece reveals a phantasmagoric scenescape of surreal images that is described as a fragment of amazement. Unable to look away, he struggles to make sense of the unfolding weirdness as his squad mates pester him for a description. He tries to comprehend what quickly becomes a rivalry experience. Wow. What's out there? A peep show, he murmured. Sweet, sweet stuff, dancing soul sisters. He giggled, and he stared through the Starlight Scope. Star bright, starlight. Don't hog it, man. Dreamland, come on. What do you see? All the secrets. I see 'em all out there. Hey! Fairy tale land, Chip whispered. He was quiet for a time. He held the machine to his eye, scanning the night, chuckling softly. I see, yeah. Now I see. Evil. No, it's sweet. Real nice, Chip giggled. I see circus. No shit. There's a circus out there. Charlie's all dressed up in clown suits. Oh yeah, real circus. The three soldiers while away at the night, taking turns staring into the strange, soft dreadness of the night. as revealed by the Starlight Scope. Finally, one of them declares, "It's not right seeing them at night. There's something evil about it," and wonders aloud when the Grim Reaper will turn up in the viewfinder. In his later book, the novel Going After Cato, O'Brien describes the visual vertigo that overcame many soldiers while looking through the Starlight Scope. In this case, it's more a physical disorientation from the outer world than the undermines of the soldier equilibrium. He put his eye to the peephole and flickered on the battery switch. The night was moving, a bright green shimmering dazzle. It was all moving. The countryside moved, the beach, the sea, everything, but he did not look away. He pressed his eyes against the peephole and watched the moving night, turning the big plastic dial to full focus, high resolution, and watch Quang Nage move. It was a trick of the machine. He knew this, so he concentrated. In other intimate mythologies of war, the eerie green landscapes generated by Starlight Scope were populated by ambiguous entities. Fatigue, stress, and fear exasperated the tendency in some soldiers to misinterpret the images they saw through the scope. What sometimes appeared to be a gorilla turned out to be a rat, a monkey, or some other jungle creature. Poisonous snakes magnified to unsettling closeness slithered amidst the phosphorus flashes of light. Mythological beasts upon a nightmare landscape. Even innate objects such as rocks and plants appeared to be the enemy soldiers advancing forward on the viewer. Soldiers described dragons and other supernatural creatures from within the withering phosphorus murk of the Starlight Scope landscape. One former medic recalls using the Starlight Scope to monitor hundreds of dead enemy bodies after a particularly intense firefight, only to discover that in the morning that the corpses were a hallucination. Another soldier linked the explosion of a moving light dots to the landscape that seemed to be always snowing. R.L. Shreddy, who was a U.S. Navy commander, served as staff historian for the Commander of Naval Forces in Vietnam under Vice Admiral Elmo Zimwan Jr. in 1969, described just such illusion while observing sailors during reconnaissance aboard the PBR patrol boat River. You take your turn on the Starlight Scope, Shreddy writes. Viewed in the eerie green glow, anything on the bank seems to move. Bushes become animate. The device transformed the night scope into something that akin to LSD hallucination. In a telling anecdote included in his Celebration Wartime Study Dispatches, the journalist Michael Herr describes the long-range reconnaissance patrol soldier who took drugs by fistful so that the jungle night would appear to him as if he viewed through the Starlight Scope. Unreal. The Starlight Scope's most powerful function was to bring elusive enemy to the American soldier's eyes. The device gave a spectral to guerrillas who had previously seemed to be like invisible ghosts. In a sense, it confirmed their phantom qualities by making them visible as otherworldly forms. Throughout the war, the Americans had referred to it as the Viet Cong as ghosts because they appeared at night and were not visible, describing the battle for the Horseshoe, which occurred in late August 1967 in the southern region of the so-called Iron Triangle of Binh Dong province. One veteran wrote, "When they searched the bunkers, they didn't find a damn thing. No empty shells, no blood, and no evidence of any kind. It was like they'd been fighting ghosts, battle for Horseshoe." By rendering humans into ghosts, the process of dehumanizing the enemy is advanced and further complicated. The scope makes them appear as spirits by showing their form without the elements that would render them fully human, such as language, emotion, and three-dimensional form. They appear as spirits without souls. Interesting. Scott's L.A. Starlight, a novel, captures the profound uneasiness that overcomes some soldiers who spent long periods of looking through the enemy Starlight Scopes. In his quasi-fantastical novel, Eli, a Vietnam War veteran himself, describes the exploits of the U.S. Army sniper, appropriately or uncannily named Tom Light, whose amazing skill ability to stay alive while telling high numbers of enemy kills inspires anxiety and dread among his fellow soldiers. Over time, Light's comrades become to believe that the scope makes the sniper clairvoyant. They become convinced that the Light can see who among them will die next. Rumours of the Light's strange powers reach the local Vietnamese, who spread the word that the American men with the Starlight Scope can raise the dead. Vietnamese families seeked him out and begged him to reanimate their recently killed kin. Although the rumours were swirling around Tom Light and his night vision device are inaccurate in their precise details, the Starlight Scope at the centre of the plot does seem to give a sniper supernatural abilities. At different points in the novel, the Starlight Scope shows skeletons dancing, dead men moving about, and in the face of the narrator's girlfriend at her home in Birmingham, Alabama. In one passage, Light attempts to explain to a fellow soldier the power of the AN/BVS-2 atop of his M16 to transform enemy soldiers into something spectral and mesmerizing. This fictional sniper describes the formerly visible in Viet Cong guerrillas as semi-transparent ghosts whose ethereal form is to cast upon an undulating nightscape. When you look at the drinks through the scope, they look like men shined up on a wall by a cabaret lantern. Light words suggest that the Starlight Scope acts as a kind of magical lantern device that used projected light and painted slides to cast ghostly images upon the screen, made a rippling effect as a technological persecutor to the motion picture magic lantern shows, often cause phantoms. I can't say that word, sorry. This word here. Sorry, I can't even get it to light up there. They were popular entertainments in Europe and North America throughout the 19th century. The most popular phantasmagoria, as the name suggests, involves stories about ghosts, demons, and other supernatural beings. According to historian and mythographer Marina Warner, who's first toyed with the magical lanterns, believed that the devices could project the interior thoughts and fears of the observers along with the images created by glass sides. They mimic the mind's affinity for interior phantoms. And as the name suggested, the magic lantern blurred the line between revelation and illusion, she writes. This device and other photocinematic machines actually brought into being models of interior light and conjured all kinds of things that do not and cannot exist except in enchanted condition, the enigma of appearances. Phantasmagorias thrilled audiences by bringing them into close proximity with the entities, many only identifiable to themselves. They feared the most. Lie's fictional sniper indicates that the Starlight Scope is having similar effect on him. He admires the ghostly forms as he hunts and watches. He begins to identify with them. The character Tom Light, as his name suggests, is a human embodiment of the Starlight Scope. As a sole possessor of the Starlight Scope in a remote base of South Vietnam, northwest border with Laos, he is attributed with the power of the second sight because the figures who appear in his viewfinder are usually in the final minutes of their lives. He is believed to be able to raise the dead because his Starlight Scope prevents men from dying by spotting enemy snipers and sappers before they can carry out their attacks. Soldiers in his immediate proximity feel safe, but rather than value Tom Light for the protective powers he and his scope bring the unit, the men at the fire base become afraid of him. They circulate apocryphal stories of past attacks on the fire base that killed everyone except Light. Light's tactical and distracted demeanour makes them uneasier, and they are unnerved by his apparent ability to kill enemy snipers deep in the jungle territory controlled by enemy forces. The visions he is rumoured to behold through the scope grow increasingly fantastic over the course of the novel. The novel's narrator describes Tom Light as smelling like decaying leaves and damp earth, the natural vestments of the newly buried. Light struggles to disabuse his fellow soldiers of the superstitions, beliefs, but to no avail. L's novels also captures the ambience about killing the guerrillas that emerges within soldiers who watch the enemy through the Starlight Scope. The novel Fry's Snoper prefers spending time outside the firebase, staying with his fellow soldiers. He seems to materialize and disappear like the ghost figure he stares at. He vanishes for long stretches of the novel to chase the North Vietnamese sniper nicknamed Tiger, who uses a stolen Starlight Scope to shoot the American soldiers from atop of the trees. Later he tracks the North Vietnamese mystical monk who, like Light himself, is reputed to have the power to bring the dead soldiers back to life. L's novel conveys the power of the Starlight Scope to disable the psyches of the American soldiers who spend long nights alone staring into what appears to be another world. L's real-life counterparts pass long stretches of their tours psychologically separated from their squad mates, many whom slept through these nights, and many may not have ever looked through this night vision device. Some Starlight Scope users appear to have identified with other denizens of night. They seem to have developed sympathy for the silent, ghostly figures they observed through their viewfinders, with which their fellow Americans never did. Sympathy for the doomed. Perhaps the most profound change that the Starlight Scope brought about concerned American perception of the enemy. It has changed that the feelings that many soldiers and Marines had towards the Viet Cong. The scope transformed the Americans' idea of the Viet Cong from an invisible and masterful opponent to a vulnerable and unaware victim. Its power to render the faces and bodies and movements from the formerly unseen insurgents humanitize them. The Americans were now able to not only observe their erstwhile invincible foes, they could study them and what was often guerrillas' last moments alive. They would consider the human pursuits, both military and mundane, of anonymous and obscure enemy labelled collectively but familiarly as Charlie. The viewers now had time to assign a more focused identity to the people they were about to annihilate. It certainly did not stop the Americans from killing the guerrillas. In practical terms, it made the act easier, but in emotional and psychological terms, it has compelled that the GIs to consider the act in a more sympathetic term. The killing of the identifiable human being was now a potentially regrettable and even tragic event. The best place to observe the transformation is in literature. More than a memoir, the literature allows veterans to express the complex physical reactions to the war, and veterans writing about the enemy in fiction, poetry, and songs have illustrated the emotional conflicts that the Starlight Scope encountered in its user. Significantly, as historians of the Vietnam War have noted, the young Americans who served in the Second Indochina War were the best educated and most literate soldiers that the United States had yet sent to war, and having acquired a secondary and post-secondary educations, both before and after serving, they were more inclined to explore their experiences as fiction and poetry rather than non-fiction. In Starlight Scope Myopia, the American poet Yosef Komaya describes the evolving opinions and emotions of an American soldier as he observes a squad of Viet Cong guerrillas through rifle-mounted Starlight Scope. The Myopia, in his title, captures the paradox of the Starlight Scope's introduction. The device shows the subject without context. It draws the enemy into the shooter's brain via the eye socket without conveying the social, cultural, political circumstances that brought him or her to that point. The observer sees bodies and movements without telling much about the soldiers, about the subtleties of human emotion. In a poem, the communist soldiers are moving provisions in the night, unaware that they have been observed and targeted. The poem traces the process of mental transformation of the watching soldier as he goes from describing the guerrillas as merely imprecise targets that have appeared in his viewfinder to something more human and thus worthy of sympathy. Grey-blue shadows lift shadows onto an ox cart, making night work for us. The Starlight Scope brings men into killing range. And as the enemy soldiers acquire more precise definitions amidst the otherworldly hues of light-amplifying technology, the viewfinder is overcome by a sense of what will be endured regret for killing the men he has been observing. Lords over loneliness, winding like coral vines through the sandalwood and lotus, inside our lowered head years after this scene. Transfixed by the image of the enemy engaged in a camaraderie interaction, he wonders about the topic of their present conversation and begins to consider the composition of their internal lives and thought processes. Caught in the infrared, what are they saying? Are they talking about women or are they calling the Americans? Very crazy. At the poem's conclusion, the viewer finds himself overcome by the impulse to warn the doomed men of the coming fuel slide that will end their lives. One of them is laughing You want to place a finger to his lips and say, shh. And, captivated by the fragility of the men before him, the soldier considers the possibility of embracing one, an older, disfigured Kare, even as he points the rifle at him. You try reading ghost talk on their lips. They say, up we go, lifting as one, this one old blog. You feel you could reach out and take him into your arms. You peer down in the sights of your M16, seeing the full moon loaded into an ox cart. His poem concludes, perhaps significantly, with that description of the American firing at the men whose images have transfixated him. With the watcher's emotional transformation complete, readers are left to wonder whether he is capable of gunning down the men who captivated him within a Starlight Scope. The Starlight Scope serves as a similarly humanizing device for an enemy soldier in a song composed during the war by U.S. Army soldier Chip Dockery while he was stationed in South Vietnam. This time, the enemy being viewed is North Vietnamese logistical support crew member. The song Sitting in the Cab of My Truck describes an enemy driver chained to the steering wheel of the truck. He is taken down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The song an American soldiers sung to the tune of Otis Redding's Sittin' On the Dock of the Bay presents the trials and the dangers that North Vietnamese teams face as they brought war material to the southbound mountain and jungle routes of the storied supply line. The song's protagonist endures exhaustion and nicotine withdrawal and dreads the return of the American bombers, a sky spot that finally come close, that could have ended his life. The song concludes with the stanza, here I sit having a nicotine fit, but God, I'm too scared to get a nicotine cigarette licked, because that might just blow up my hope of not showing up on the Starlight Scope. Like his poem, Dockery's song humanizes the spectral enemy. It renders his characters and condition familiar to most GIs by verifying his internal life and describing his emotions. It allows him the same fears of uncertainties that wreck these American counterparts. With no mention of the political divisions or nationalistic fervour, it also includes interesting topical projection. The driver, as imagined by the American composer, understands his survival depends on his ability to keep his image off the Starlight Scope. The desperate Northerner is able to mentally place himself into not only the visual sight of his American opponent, but into the device that the GI will use to render him visible before killing him. The Starlight Scope did not merely transform nighttime warfare. It changed how humans carry out all activities previously complicated by dark. So revolutionary was the device that militaries around the world, especially the United States, chief of Cold War rival, the Soviet Union, rushed to duplicate the breakthrough of the American technology. But in the process of winning the race to develop and deploy this seemingly miraculous device, the US military labs did not take the time to test the physical and emotional effects of the Starlight Scope on those who would use it. They did not anticipate the consequences of inducing the secret technology in the wartime, nor did they appear to realize that the same device could expose a formerly invisible enemy to a verified hidden areas of the GI's psychics. Today, this technology is so unnerved the earliest adopters of the Vietnam War and devastated their opponents is a commonplace in camera, binoculars, car technology and other common devices. Look back over the history of its wartime introduction. It indicates that now protein technology infiltrated the complex physical, psychological and practical dilemmas of the soldiers who first used them. As Dockery, Cromwell, O'Brien and many memorists have demonstrated, the Starlight Scope light's amplifying powers were capable not only of making targets easier to see, it could also paradoxically make it harder for an American on the other side to pull the trigger. The scope contemplated killing by providing a highly mediated image of the enemy that produced an engrossing but incomplete image of a human target. Excuse me. It also destabilized the user's understanding of the physical terrain that he occupied, and the asymmetry of being the sole possessor of this technology made some soldiers feel ambivalent about using it to kill the unsuspecting. Burdened by the weight, untested technology, unfamiliarity, secrecy, and the disforming personal revelations, soldiers using the Starlight Scope for the first time endured unforeseen problems, and it is for this reason that war planners, weapon developers, and military personnel themselves can benefit from the figurative light shed by the murky early history of the Starlight Scope. So, wow, what do you reckon about that? That's pretty cool. I'll try and find the story about the blokes and the helicopters and how there were winged creatures flying behind them. And the technology, like this specific one, was changed. Like they tinkered with it and changed some of the spectrum because they were seeing stuff that we shouldn't see. You know, I wonder if they were sort of chasing stuff like, if they live as real. I wonder if it's something like that they're chasing. You never know. You'll never know. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you're still there. If you're here still, raise your vibrations and just know you're loved. So, I hope you have a fantastic day. We had a fantastic day. Anyway, thanks for watching. Raise your vibrations. Much love. Bye now.